In the sweltering late summer of 1883, 52 tobacco workers vanished without a trace from the Crofton Plantation in central Virginia. No bodies were ever found. No ransom demands were made. The local sheriff's investigation lasted a mere 4 days before being mysteriously closed by order of the county judge. For over 140 years, the families of Hanover County have whispered about that suffocating August night when an entire work crew simply disappeared from one of Virginia's most prosperous tobacco estates. Official records state that the workers abandoned their contracts and fled north. But recently discovered letters hidden for generations in the walls of the old Crofton Manor tell a very different story. Before we continue with the story of the Crofton Plantation and uncover what really happened to those 52 souls, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments below, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our viewers across America. What those letters reveal will challenge everything historians thought they knew about labor conditions in post-Reconstruction Virginia. A post-Reconstruction success story? The Crofton Plantation stretched across nearly 4,000 acres of Virginia's fertile Piedmont region, where the rich red soil had made tobacco cultivation a gold mine for generations. Established in 1785 by English immigrant Arthur Crofton, the estate had weathered the Revolution, the War of 1812, and most recently the devastating changes brought by the Civil War and Reconstruction. By 1883, the plantation was under the management of Arthur's grandson, Nathaniel Crofton, a man known throughout Hanover County for his keen business sense and his ability to adapt to the new economic realities of a post-slavery South. Unlike many plantation owners who had lost everything after emancipation, Nathaniel had successfully transitioned to a contract labor system, offering decent wages and housing to both former slaves and poor white families desperate for steady work. The summer of 1883 promised to be the most profitable in the plantation's history. The tobacco crop was exceptional, with broad, healthy leaves that would fetch premium prices at the Richmond markets. Nathaniel had assembled a diverse workforce of 52 men, women, and teenage children, a mixture of freed slaves who had chosen to stay on the land they knew, Italian immigrants fleeing poverty, and local white families struggling to make ends meet in the economically uncertain times following the war. Among the workers were names that would later haunt the county records. Isaiah Washington, a former slave who had earned Nathaniel's trust as a field supervisor; Guido Rossi, an Italian immigrant whose letters to his family in Naples painted a picture of hope and steady work; Eleanor Davies, a widow with 4 children who had found refuge and employment at Crofton after her husband's death in a logging accident; and Jedediah Stone, a young white man from the mountains of western Virginia, who had come seeking a better life than the hardscrabble farming that had claimed his father's health. The plantation operated like a small town. The workers lived in neat rows of wooden cabins behind the main house, each family allotted a small garden plot for vegetables. Nathaniel had built a general store where workers could purchase necessities, a small schoolhouse where the children learned to read and write, and even a chapel where traveling preachers held services twice a month. To outside observers, Crofton Plantation represented a success story, a former slave plantation transformed into a thriving agricultural enterprise that provided dignity and opportunity to people from vastly different backgrounds. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, tensions simmered. The summer of 1883 was not just any summer in America. It was a time when the nation was rebuilding, yet still grappling with the lingering resentments of the war and the unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction. In Virginia, as in much of the South, white supremacist groups like the Knights of the White Camellia remained active, terrorizing black communities and any whites who dared to work alongside them as equals. The integrated workforce at Crofton Plantation was an anomaly that drew attention, not all of it welcome. Local newspaper editor Silas Thorne had written several editorials questioning the social experiment at Crofton, arguing that such integration was unnatural and dangerous to the established order. Several neighboring plantation owners, still bitter about their losses during the war, viewed Nathaniel's success with a mixture of envy and resentment. There were rumors of nighttime meetings, of hooded riders seen on the roads near the plantation, of threats whispered in the darkness. The last day, August 19, 1883 August 19, 1883 started like any other late summer day at Crofton Plantation. The workers rose before dawn to beat the crushing Virginia heat, gathering their tools and heading to the tobacco fields as the first pale light crept across the rolling hills. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet, pungent smell of ripening tobacco leaves. Cardinals called from the oak trees that dotted the landscape, their songs mixing with the low conversations of the workers as they began another day of the harvest that would determine their prosperity for the coming year. Isaiah Washington, the field supervisor, had assigned the crews to different sections of the plantation that morning. The main group of 35 workers was sent to the western fields, where the tobacco plants were at their peak and needed immediate attention. 17 others were assigned to the curing barns, where the delicate process of drying and preparing the already harvested leaves required constant monitoring. By 7 in the morning, all 52 workers were accounted for and at their posts. Nathaniel Crofton made his usual morning rounds, riding his roan mare through the fields and stopping to speak with various crew leaders about the day's tasks. Several workers later recalled that he seemed particularly pleased with the quality of the crop and had mentioned plans to expand operations the following year. "This harvest will set us up for years to come," he told Isaiah Washington as they examined a particularly fine section of tobacco plants. "Every family here will see good money from this season." As the day progressed, the oppressive heat drove temperatures well above 90 degrees. The workers moved methodically through the rows of tobacco, cutting the mature plants and loading them onto wooden wagons for transport to the curing barns. Eleanor Davies was overheard joking with her fellow workers about how the sweat running down their faces would season the tobacco leaves. Guido Rossi sang Italian folk songs to keep the work crew's spirits up as they labored under the blazing sun. At noon, the plantation bell rang for the midday meal, and all 52 workers gathered in the shade of the large oak trees near the main house. They shared simple fare, cornbread, beans, and cold buttermilk. While discussing the morning's progress, several workers mentioned strange visitors they had seen on the plantation roads earlier that week, well-dressed men in dark suits, who had ridden through without stopping to speak with anyone. Isaiah Washington had assumed they were potential tobacco buyers scouting the operation, but something about their demeanor had made him uneasy. After the meal, work resumed. The afternoon shift focused on the more delicate tasks of selecting and preparing the finest tobacco leaves for premium market grades. The workers labored until sunset, when the plantation bell rang again to signal the end of the workday. As had been the custom for months, all 52 workers gathered at the general store to collect their daily wages. Nathaniel Crofton believed in paying his workers at the end of each day, rather than waiting for weekly payouts, a practice that had earned him considerable loyalty. Jedediah Stone, who kept meticulous records of the daily wage distributions, noted in his journal that evening that every worker had been present and accounted for at 6:45 when the last wages were handed out. The workers then dispersed to their cabins for supper and rest, many gathering on their front porches to enjoy the cooling evening air and share stories of the day. But something happened in the darkness between sunset and sunrise. Something that would turn a prosperous Virginia plantation into the center of one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. When Nathaniel Crofton rang the morning bell at 5:45 on August 20th, no one came. The cabins that had housed 52 people the night before stood empty, their doors hanging open, their occupants vanished without a trace. Personal belongings remained scattered on tables and beds, half-finished meals, children's toys, letters waiting to be mailed. But of the 52 men, women, and children who had worked the tobacco fields just hours before, there was no sign. The investigation and its abrupt end the disappearance sent shockwaves through Hanover County. Nathaniel Crofton immediately rode to the county seat in Hanover Courthouse, Virginia, to report the mass vanishing to Sheriff Elijah Vance. The sheriff, a gruff Confederate veteran who had seen his share of violence and chaos, initially dismissed the report as mass desertion. "Workers abandon contracts all the time," he told Crofton, "especially when harvest season ends and they think they can find better wages elsewhere." But Crofton pressed the sheriff to investigate. The harvest was far from over. The workers would have forfeited weeks of premium wages by leaving at that moment. More troubling were the personal effects left behind. Eleanor Davies' life savings, nearly $50 in silver coins, remained in a locked box under her bed. Guido Rossi's precious letters from his family in Naples, his only connection to kin, lay scattered on his cabin floor. Children's Sunday clothes, carefully mended and preserved for church services, hung on pegs as if their owners had simply stepped outside for a moment. Sheriff Vance assembled a small search party and spent 4 days combing the plantation grounds and the surrounding countryside. They found curious evidence that raised more questions than it answered. Horse tracks suggested that multiple riders had visited the plantation during the night of August 19th, but the tracks were deliberately obscured and impossible to follow beyond the main road. Several workers' cabins showed signs of hasty departure, overturned chairs, scattered belongings, but others appeared to have been left in normal order, as if their occupants had simply vanished from their beds. Most disturbing were the discoveries in the tobacco fields themselves. The workers had left their tools exactly where they had been working, arranged in neat rows, as was their habit. But someone had come through after their disappearance and systematically destroyed approximately 4 acres of the finest tobacco plants, cutting them down and burning them in small piles throughout the western fields. The destruction seemed purposeful rather than random, targeting the most valuable sections of the crop. On August 24th, just as Sheriff Vance was expanding his investigation to include neighboring counties, he received an unexpected visit from County Judge Thaddeus Blackwood. Blackwood, a wealthy landowner with political connections throughout Virginia, informed the sheriff that the investigation was to be immediately closed. The official record would state that the 52 workers had violated their contracts and fled north, possibly to find work in the growing industrial cities of Ohio and Pennsylvania. When Sheriff Vance protested that the evidence suggested something far more sinister, Judge Blackwood produced a stack of legal documents. Someone, he would not say who, had come forward with information proving that the missing workers had been involved in illegal activities. The details were sealed by court order, but Blackwood assured the sheriff that closing the investigation was in the best interest of everyone involved. Any further inquiry would only bring unwanted attention to Hanover County and potentially damage the region's reputation and economic prospects. Nathaniel Crofton was devastated by both the loss of his workers and the abrupt end of the investigation. He spent his own money hiring private investigators from Richmond, but they found no trace of the missing people. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, famous for their thoroughness, sent 2 agents who spent weeks following leads throughout Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland. Their final report, filed in October 1883, concluded that 52 people could not simply vanish without leaving some trace unless extraordinary measures were taken to ensure their disappearance. As the months passed, the abandoned cabins at Crofton Plantation began to decay. Nathaniel could not bring himself to hire new workers to live in the homes of the vanished, and the tobacco operation, that had once been the pride of Hanover County, fell into decline. Local families whispered theories about what had happened. Some believed the workers had been murdered by the Knights of the White Camellia for daring to work as equals across racial lines. Others suspected they had been kidnapped and sold into illegal bondage in remote mining operations. A few wondered if they had witnessed something they shouldn't have and been eliminated to protect powerful interests. The mystery deepened in 1887 when a drifter passing through Hanover County claimed to have seen Eleanor Davies in a Baltimore boarding house. He described her perfectly, including the distinctive burn scar on her right arm from a childhood accident. When authorities investigated, they found that a woman matching her description had indeed stayed at the boarding house for 3 days in July 1887, but had left no name and paid her bill in gold coins. The boarding housekeeper remembered her asking repeatedly about safe passage to Canada, but she had disappeared one morning without explanation. This single unverified sighting was the only potential trace of any of the 52 missing workers ever reported. As the years passed and no other evidence emerged, the story of the Crofton Plantation workers became a local legend, told and retold around kitchen tables and in country stores throughout central Virginia. The truth about what happened to the 52 workers might have remained buried forever if not for the curiosity of Eleanor Crofton, Nathaniel's great-niece, who inherited the decaying plantation house in 1928. Margaret, a history professor from Charlottesville with a passion for family history, was determined to restore the mansion and uncover the full story of her family's mysterious legacy. Unearthing the conspiracy as she worked to renovate the house, Eleanor made a series of discoveries that gradually unveiled a conspiracy far more complex and sinister than anyone had imagined. While removing water-damaged wallpaper from Nathaniel's former study, she found a collection of letters that had been carefully sealed inside the walls. Correspondence that Nathaniel had apparently hidden shortly before his own death in 1888. The letters revealed that the troubles at Crofton Plantation had begun months before the workers' disappearance. Starting in early 1883, Nathaniel had received increasingly threatening messages from a group calling itself the Virginia Protectorate, a secretive organization apparently composed of wealthy landowners, politicians, and businessmen who opposed the integration and economic success of operations like Crofton Plantation. One letter, dated June 10, 1883, was particularly chilling. "Mr. Crofton, your social experiment has gone too far. The mixing of races in positions of equality is an abomination that threatens the natural order of our society. You have been warned before, but you continue to flaunt your disrespect for Southern tradition. The Protectorate has voted. You will cease these activities immediately or face consequences that will serve as a warning to others who might follow your misguided example." Another letter from July 1883 was even more explicit. "Your workers have been observed attending integrated social gatherings, and your operation has become a beacon for radical elements seeking to undermine our way of life. Dissolve your workforce immediately and adopt proper labor practices, or the Protectorate will take action to protect the interests of this county." Do not mistake this for an idle threat. Eleanor found evidence that Nathaniel had taken these threats seriously. He had written to the governor of Virginia requesting protection, but his letter had apparently been intercepted or ignored. He had also contacted the federal authorities in Richmond, but post-Reconstruction enforcement of civil rights had become increasingly lax, and federal interest in protecting integrated workforces had waned considerably by 1883. Most revealing was a letter Nathaniel had written to his brother in South Carolina, dated just 2 days before the disappearance. "Thomas, I fear I have made a terrible mistake. My attempts to build something good and decent have attracted the attention of men who will stop at nothing to maintain their vision of how things should be. I have tried to protect my workers, but I may have only made them targets. If something happens to me or to them, look for answers among the men who meet in the basement of the Blackwood estate on the second Tuesday of each month. They call themselves patriots, but they are something far darker." This reference to County Judge Thaddeus Blackwood, the same man who had ordered the investigation closed, sent Eleanor searching through county records for additional evidence. What she found was a pattern of suspicious activity that had been carefully concealed for decades. In the months following the Crofton disappearances, several other integrated work operations throughout central Virginia had experienced similar problems. Workers had been intimidated, buildings had been burned, and contracts had been mysteriously canceled. The perpetrators were never identified, but county records showed that in each case, the investigation had been quickly closed by order of local judges. More disturbing was Eleanor's discovery that several of the men she suspected of involvement in the Virginia Protectorate had grown conspicuously wealthy in the late 1880s, despite the economic depression that had affected most of the region. Thaddeus Blackwood, in particular, had purchased 4 additional plantations between 1884 and 1887, expanding his holdings by nearly 12,000 acres at a time when most landowners were struggling to maintain their existing properties. Eleanor's investigation took on new urgency when she discovered a coded ledger hidden beneath the floorboards of Nathaniel's bedroom. The ledger contained detailed records of meetings, names, and financial transactions that painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal organization that had operated throughout Virginia for years. The codes were complex, but Eleanor's background as a history professor helped her recognize patterns and eventually decipher much of the content. The ledger revealed that the Virginia Protectorate was far more than a local hate group. It was a criminal enterprise that used intimidation and violence to eliminate competition and seize valuable properties throughout the region. Integrated operations like Crofton Plantation were targeted not just for ideological reasons, but because their success threatened the economic dominance of Protectorate members who relied on cheap, exploited labor to maintain their profits. Eleanor's investigation had attracted attention, the wrong kind of attention. In late 1929, she began receiving anonymous warnings to abandon her research into the plantation's history. Someone broke into her Charlottesville apartment and searched through her papers, though nothing was stolen. Her mail was apparently being intercepted, as several letters from historical societies and researchers who had offered to help with her investigation never reached her. The harassment escalated when Eleanor hired a private investigator to help trace the surviving families of the missing workers. The investigator, a former Richmond police detective named Arthur Vance, had made significant progress in tracking down descendants of several workers when he was found dead in his office, apparently from a heart attack. However, his files related to the Crofton case had been removed, and his secretary reported that two well-dressed men had visited the office the day before his death, claiming to represent interested parties who wanted the investigation stopped. Despite these warnings, Eleanor pressed forward with her research, driven by a growing conviction that the 52 workers had not simply disappeared. They had been murdered, and their deaths had been covered up by some of the most powerful men in Virginia. Her breakthrough came when she located Sarah Washington, the elderly granddaughter of Isaiah Washington, one of the missing workers. Sarah, now living in Philadelphia, had preserved her grandfather's letters and had spent decades searching for information about Isaiah's fate. She revealed to Eleanor that Isaiah's final letter, dated August 17, 1883, had contained disturbing information about tensions at the plantation. "Dear Ruth," the letter read, "something evil is brewing here in Virginia. Guido Rossi told me yesterday that men have been watching the plantation at night, sitting on horses just beyond the treeline. Mr. Crofton has been nervous and short-tempered, which is not like him. Some of the workers are talking about leaving, but the harvest is so close to completion that most of us want to see it through. The money will set our families up for the winter and beyond. But I have a feeling in my bones that something terrible is going to happen. If you do not hear from me soon, contact the authorities in Philadelphia and tell them that Isaiah Washington did not abandon his job willingly." This letter provided the first direct evidence that the workers had sensed danger before their disappearance. But Sarah had even more shocking information to share. In 1898, 15 years after the disappearance, she had received a visit from a stranger who claimed to have information about Isaiah's fate. The man, who would not give his name, told Sarah that Isaiah and the others had been killed on the night of August 19, 1883, and their bodies disposed of in a way that would ensure they were never found. The stranger claimed to have been present during the killings, but said he had been bound by oath never to reveal the details. However, guilt had tormented him for 15 years, and he wanted Isaiah's family to know that their loved one had died bravely, trying to protect the women and children in the group. Before disappearing again, the stranger left Sarah with a cryptic clue. "If you want to find where they rest, look for the place where the tobacco grows tallest, where the soil is richest, where the red clay runs deepest." Eleanor realized that this clue might refer to a specific location on the Crofton plantation. Virginia's red clay soil was famous for producing exceptional tobacco, but certain areas were known to be particularly fertile. She returned to the plantation with a team of agricultural experts and began testing soil composition throughout the property. Their investigation led them to a section of the western fields where the tobacco had historically grown with unusual vigor, the same area where the mysterious crop destruction had occurred immediately after the workers' disappearance. Soil samples from this area showed significantly higher levels of phosphorus and nitrogen than surrounding fields, a composition that could be explained by the decomposition of organic matter deep beneath the surface. Just when Eleanor thought she was close to solving the mystery, she received a visit that would change everything. County Judge Thomas Blackwood, Thaddeus Blackwood's son, who had inherited both his father's position and his secrets, arrived at the plantation accompanied by 2 attorneys and a court order. The order, signed by a judge in Charlottesville, prohibited any further excavation or disturbance of the plantation grounds, citing historical preservation concerns and respect for private property rights. But Eleanor had learned enough to know she was close to the truth. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, revealing a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of Virginia society. Before she could be stopped, she would uncover evidence that would expose not just what happened to the 52 workers, but why they had to die and who had given the order for their deaths. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Hanover County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of murder and conspiracy that shook Virginia to its core. The unveiling of a massacre. Eleanor Crofton's final breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While being forced to halt her excavation of the plantation grounds, she had befriended Reverend Daniel Washington, the elderly great-grandson of Isaiah Washington, the missing field supervisor. Daniel, now in his 80s, had grown up hearing whispered stories about his grandfather's fate from older family members who had been too frightened to speak openly about what they suspected. The old man's hands trembled as he sat across from Eleanor in her modest hotel room in Hanover Courthouse, Virginia, on that cold January evening in 1930. Outside, snow fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the small town and creating an atmosphere of isolation that seemed appropriate for the terrible secrets he was about to reveal. For nearly an hour, Daniel had sat in silence, wrestling with a decision that would break a promise his family had kept for almost 50 years. "Miss Crofton," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there are some burdens that get heavier with time, not lighter. My great-grandmother made me swear on the Bible that I would never tell what she saw that night. But I'm 83 years old, and I can't take this secret to my grave knowing that my grandfather and all those good people are lying in unmarked dirt while their killers' families live in mansions built on blood money." As Daniel began his story, Eleanor realized that everything she had discovered so far was just the surface of a conspiracy far more elaborate and horrifying than she had imagined. His great-grandmother, Isaiah's wife Miriam, had not been at the plantation on the night of August 19, 1883. She had been in Richmond caring for her brother John, who was dying of pneumonia. This absence, which had probably saved her life, had also made her the only witness to the immediate aftermath of what would become known as the Crofton Massacre. Miriam had returned to the plantation on the morning of August 20th, expecting to find her husband and the other workers beginning another day of harvest. Instead, she had found an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. The workers' cabins stood empty, doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Children's toys lay scattered in the dirt, and the morning meal preparations had been abandoned mid-task. Pots of grits still sat over cold fires, and coffee grounds were spilled across kitchen tables, as if people had been interrupted in the middle of their morning routines. But Miriam was not just any worker's wife. She had been born into slavery on a Georgia plantation and had developed the survival instincts that had kept her alive through the horrors of bondage and the chaos of the Civil War. When she sensed danger, she knew to hide first and investigate later. Instead of calling out for her husband or approaching the main house, she had concealed herself in the dense woods that bordered the western fields and waited to see what would reveal itself. What she witnessed over the next several hours would haunt her for the rest of her life. As the sun climbed higher, bringing the oppressive heat that was typical of Virginia summers, Miriam saw wagons emerging from the western fields. Not the usual tobacco wagons, but heavy freight wagons with reinforced beds and canvas covers. The wagons were driven by men she didn't recognize, but accompanying them on horseback were several figures she knew all too well. County Judge Thaddeus Blackwood rode at the front of the procession, his usually immaculate clothing stained with what looked like dirt and something darker. Behind him came Sheriff Elijah Vance from the county courthouse, Mayor Frederick Hayes from the town of Hanover, and Dr. Walter Jenkins, ironically no relation to the missing Eleanor Davies, but the county's most respected physician and a man Miriam had always trusted. Seeing these pillars of the community involved in whatever had happened to the workers filled her with a terror beyond anything she had experienced even during the darkest days of slavery. The procession moved slowly toward the main road, and Miriam counted at least 10 wagons, all heavily loaded and covered. The men riding alongside spoke in low, urgent tones, but the summer air carried fragments of their conversation to her hiding place. She heard references to the northern route, the arrangements in Petersburg, and most chillingly, making sure there are no traces left behind. But Miriam's nightmare was far from over. After the wagons disappeared down the main road, another group of men arrived at the plantation. These were not the respectable community leaders she had recognized earlier, but rough-looking individuals who moved with the purposeful efficiency of men accustomed to violence. They immediately began a systematic destruction of evidence that revealed the premeditated nature of what had occurred. The men went through each abandoned cabin methodically, removing anything that might identify the missing workers or provide clues about their fate. Personal letters were gathered and burned in a large fire behind the main house. Clothing and personal effects were loaded onto smaller wagons and hauled away. Most disturbing of all, the men brought buckets of some chemical substance. Later, Miriam would realize it was lye and scattered it throughout the cabins and surrounding areas, presumably to destroy any biological evidence that might remain. As Miriam watched this systematic erasure of 52 human lives, she began to understand that she was witnessing not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned operation that had been organized well in advance. The men worked with military precision, following what was clearly a predetermined plan. They knew exactly where to look for important documents, which areas to treat with chemicals, and how to eliminate any trace that the workers had ever existed. The most horrifying moment came when Miriam saw several of the men return from the western fields carrying bloodied tools and clothing. They fed these items into the fire behind the main house, and the acrid smell of burning fabric and something else, something organic and terrible, drifted through the humid air to her hiding place. It was then that Miriam fully understood that her husband and all the other workers were dead, and that their bodies had been disposed of somewhere in those western fields. But the nightmare still wasn't over. As the afternoon wore on, Miriam watched as the conspirators began the next phase of their plan, creating a false narrative to explain the workers' disappearance. Nathaniel Crofton himself arrived at the plantation around 3 o'clock, riding hard from the direction of Hanover. From his behavior, it was clear that he had no idea what had transpired. His shock and horror upon discovering the empty cabins seemed genuine, and Miriam watched as he frantically searched for any sign of his workers. What happened next revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Judge Blackwood approached Nathaniel with what appeared to be a prepared explanation. Miriam couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she caught enough fragments to understand that Blackwood was telling Nathaniel that the workers had been threatened by local vigilantes and had fled during the night for their own safety. Blackwood produced documents that he claimed proved the workers had violated their contracts and abandoned their jobs. Nathaniel's anguished protests were met with calm assurances from Blackwood that everything possible would be done to locate the missing workers. But Miriam could see what Nathaniel could not. The subtle signals being exchanged between Blackwood and the other men, the way they positioned themselves to control the conversation, the practiced manner in which they redirected Nathaniel's questions and concerns. As evening approached, Miriam realized that she was in mortal danger. If the conspirators discovered that anyone had witnessed their activities, they would not hesitate to eliminate that witness. She began to carefully work her way deeper into the woods, planning to remain hidden until she could safely leave the area. But as she moved through the underbrush, she overheard a conversation that revealed the full horror of what she had witnessed. Two of the rough-looking men were standing near the edge of the woods, smoking and discussing the day's events. One was complaining about the physical difficulty of the work they had done in the western fields. The other responded with casual brutality that made Miriam's blood run cold. 52 bodies don't bury themselves, especially when you got to dig deep enough that they won't ever be found. The first man chuckled and replied, "The lie will take care of any evidence, and by next spring, this will be the most fertile tobacco ground in Virginia. Fitting, ain't it? The ones who thought they were too good to know their place will end up fertilizing the crops that make their betters rich." This conversation confirmed Miriam's worst fears about her husband's fate, but it also provided crucial information about the location of the mass grave, the western fields where the conspirators had spent the day working, where the tobacco had always grown with unusual vigor. This was where Isaiah and the others had been buried. Miriam waited in the woods until well after midnight before beginning her careful journey away from the plantation. She didn't dare return to her cabin to collect her belongings, knowing that the conspirators might be watching for anyone who tried to claim the workers' possessions. Instead, she made her way on foot to Richmond, where her dying brother provided cover for her presence in the area. But Miriam's ordeal was far from over. In the days that followed, she learned that the conspiracy extended far beyond what she had witnessed at the plantation. When Sheriff Vance began his investigation, Miriam considered coming forward with what she had seen. But before she could make contact with the sheriff, she received a visit from two men who identified themselves as friends who wanted to make sure she understood the importance of remaining silent about recent events. The men never explicitly threatened her, but their message was clear. They knew who she was, they knew what she had seen, and they were watching her. They suggested that she might want to consider leaving Virginia permanently, perhaps joining the many former slaves who were migrating north in search of better opportunities. They even offered to provide her with money for travel expenses, making it clear that this was not generosity, but payment for her silence. Terrified for her life and realizing that the conspiracy included people with the power to reach her anywhere in Virginia, Miriam made the agonizing decision to remain silent. She used the travel money to relocate to Philadelphia, where she found work as a domestic servant and tried to build a new life. But she never forgot what she had witnessed, and she never forgave herself for not finding a way to seek justice for her husband and the other victims. Years later, when she felt it was safe to return to Virginia, Miriam began the careful process of documenting what she had seen. She wrote detailed accounts of the events, created maps showing the location of the mass grave, and compiled a list of everyone she had recognized among the conspirators. She hid these records carefully, knowing that they might be the only evidence that would ever exist of the Crofton massacre. When Miriam finally told her son about what she had witnessed, she made him promise that the information would be passed down through the family until it was safe to reveal the truth. She died in 1908, taking her secrets with her, but leaving behind a legacy of evidence that would eventually help expose one of the most heinous crimes in Virginia history. Now in 1930, Daniel Washington was breaking his great-grandmother's trust and his family's silence because he had come to understand that some promises are meant to be broken when they serve to protect evil. As he finished telling Miriam's story to Eleanor Crofton, tears streamed down his weathered face. "Miss Crofton," he said, "my great-grandmother spent her whole life carrying the weight of what she saw. She died believing that justice would never come for my grandfather and the others. But maybe if we're brave enough to speak the truth now, we can finally give them some peace." Eleanor realized that Miriam's testimony was the missing piece that would allow her to understand not just what had happened to the 52 workers, but how the conspiracy had been organized and covered up. But Daniel had more evidence to share. Hidden in the basement of his small house was Miriam's carefully preserved documentation: maps, lists of names, detailed timelines, and most importantly, a diagram showing the exact location where she had seen the conspirators returning from their grisly work in the western fields. The evidence Miriam had compiled over the years painted a picture of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the local level. The Virginia Protectorate, as they called themselves, was part of a regional network of terrorist organizations that had formed in response to the social and economic changes brought by Reconstruction. These groups operated with the knowledge and protection of politicians, judges, and business leaders who shared their commitment to maintaining white supremacy and economic exploitation. The decision to eliminate the Crofton plantation workers had been made at a meeting in Richmond in June 1883, attended by representatives from Protectorate chapters throughout Virginia and neighboring states. The integrated workforce at Crofton was seen as a dangerous example that might inspire similar experiments elsewhere. If such operations could succeed, it would prove that the South could prosper without maintaining the racial oppression and exploitative labor practices that benefited the Protectorate's members. The massacre had been planned with military precision. The timing was carefully chosen to coincide with the height of harvest season, when the workers would be most reluctant to leave, and when their disappearance would cause maximum economic damage to Nathaniel Crofton. The location was selected because the western field's remote position would allow the conspirators to work without being observed from the main house or the nearby road. Most chilling of all, Miriam's records revealed that the Crofton massacre was not an isolated incident. The Virginia Protectorate had been responsible for similar operations throughout the region, targeting integrated workforces, Republican politicians, civil rights activists, and anyone who challenged the post-Reconstruction social order. The group maintained detailed records of their activities, treating terrorism and murder as simply another form of business enterprise. Armed with this evidence, Eleanor finally understood why her investigation had drawn such intense opposition. The descendants and successors of the original Protectorate members still held positions of power throughout Virginia, and they were determined to prevent the exposure of their ancestors' crimes. The conspiracy had been passed down through generations, maintaining its secrecy through intimidation, corruption, and the careful placement of sympathizers in positions of authority. But Eleanor also realized that she now possessed evidence that could finally bring justice for the 52 murdered workers. Miriam's documentation provided not just proof of what had happened, but the names of those responsible and the location of their unmarked grave. For the first time in nearly 50 years, there was hope that the truth about the Crofton massacre would finally be revealed. Justice, decades later armed with Miriam Washington's explosive testimony and documentation, Eleanor Crofton faced the most dangerous moment of her investigation. She now possessed evidence that could expose a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for nearly half a century. But she also knew that the same forces that had silenced Miriam and murdered Arthur Vance would not hesitate to eliminate her if they discovered what she had learned. Eleanor's first priority was ensuring the survival of the evidence. Working in secret during the harsh winter of 1930 to 1931, she created multiple copies of all of Miriam's documentation and her own research findings. She used her connections as a history professor to distribute these copies to trusted contacts throughout the country. Historical societies in Boston and Chicago, civil rights organizations in New York and Atlanta, and journalists in cities far from Virginia, where local pressure could not reach them. But Eleanor also understood that simply releasing the evidence would not guarantee justice. The Virginia Protectorate had survived for 50 years by controlling the very institutions that should have brought them to justice. Local law enforcement, county judges, and state politicians had either been corrupted or intimidated into silence. If the truth was going to emerge, it would require a more sophisticated strategy than simply presenting evidence to authorities who might be part of the conspiracy themselves. Eleanor's breakthrough came when she made contact with federal investigators who had been quietly building a case against organized terrorist groups throughout the South. The federal government's interest in such organizations had waned considerably since the end of Reconstruction, but a small group of Justice Department officials remained committed to prosecuting crimes that local authorities refused to address. Special Agent Marcus Green, based in the Justice Department's Richmond office, had been investigating reports of organized violence against African Americans and their white allies throughout Virginia for several years. When Eleanor approached him with Miriam's evidence, Green realized that she had uncovered documentation of criminal activity that extended far beyond anything his office had previously been able to prove. Green's investigation revealed that the Virginia Protectorate was indeed part of a much larger network. Similar organizations operated throughout the South, using terrorism and murder to maintain systems of racial and economic oppression. These groups had evolved from the earlier Ku Klux Klan and Knights of the White Camellia, but operated with greater sophistication and deeper political connections. They maintained careful records of their activities, treating violence as a business enterprise that required the same level of organization and planning as any other commercial venture. The federal investigation into the Protectorate took over 3 years to complete. Working in coordination with investigators from other states, Green's team gradually built a comprehensive picture of the organization's structure, membership, and criminal activities. They discovered that the group had been responsible for hundreds of murders, thousands of acts of intimidation, and systematic corruption of legal and political institutions throughout the region. The Crofton Massacre emerged as one of the most thoroughly documented crimes in the Protectorate's history, thanks to Miriam's careful record-keeping and Eleanor's persistent investigation. The evidence was so comprehensive that it provided federal prosecutors with their strongest case against the surviving members of the conspiracy. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their scope and in complexity. In 1934, federal grand juries in Richmond, Charlottesville, and Norfolk returned indictments against 58 individuals connected to the Virginia Protectorate, including several sitting judges, county officials, and business leaders. The charges ranged from conspiracy to commit murder to violations of federal civil rights laws. The trials that began in 1935 created a sensation throughout Virginia and the nation. For the first time, the full extent of post-Reconstruction terrorism was exposed in open court, with detailed testimony about organized violence that had been hidden for decades. The proceedings revealed not just the specific details of the Crofton Massacre, but the broader system of terror that had been used to maintain white supremacy throughout the South. County Judge Thomas Blackwood, facing overwhelming evidence of his father's role in organizing the massacre, chose to cooperate with federal prosecutors rather than face trial. His testimony provided crucial details about the Protectorate's structure and operations, confirming much of what Miriam had documented and revealing additional crimes that had never been investigated. Blackwood's confession was both devastating and cathartic. He described how his father had received orders from Protectorate leaders in Richmond to eliminate the Crofton workers as an example to other integrated operations throughout the region. The massacre had been planned months in advance, with detailed consideration given to timing, logistics, and cover-up procedures. The conspirators had even prepared legal documents in advance to explain the workers' disappearance and prevent serious investigation. Most shocking was Blackwood's revelation that the Protectorate had maintained detailed financial records of their criminal activities. Murder and intimidation were treated as business expenses, with careful accounting of costs and benefits. The elimination of the Crofton workers was seen as a profitable investment that would discourage similar integrated operations and preserve the Protectorate's economic advantages. The trials also revealed the extent to which the conspiracy had corrupted Virginia's legal and political systems. Several judges had dismissed cases against Protectorate members without cause. Sheriffs had refused to investigate obvious crimes, and politicians had blocked legislation that might have interfered with the group's activities. The conspiracy had operated with virtual impunity, because it controlled the very institutions that should have stopped it. As the legal proceedings continued, Eleanor worked with federal authorities to locate and properly bury the remains of the 52 murdered workers. Using Miriam's maps and additional investigation, archaeologists located the mass grave in the western fields of the old Crofton Plantation. The discovery confirmed the most horrific details of Miriam's testimony. The workers had indeed been buried in a carefully prepared site designed to ensure their bodies would never be found. The excavation of the mass grave was conducted with the dignity and respect that had been denied to the victims in death. Each set of remains was carefully documented and, where possible, identified through personal effects or dental records. The workers were finally given proper burials in a cemetery in Hanover, Virginia, with headstones bearing their names and a monument commemorating their sacrifice. The memorial service held for the 52 workers drew hundreds of attendees from throughout Virginia and beyond. Family members who had never known what happened to their ancestors finally had answers and closure. Civil rights leaders spoke about the broader significance of the massacre and the importance of confronting historical injustices. Eleanor Crofton was recognized for her courage in uncovering the truth, but she deflected credit to Miriam Washington and the other family members who had preserved the evidence at great personal risk. The federal trials resulted in convictions for 45 of the 58 defendants. Sentences ranged from 10 years to life in prison, with the harshest punishments reserved for those who had directly participated in the murders. Several defendants died before trial, and others fled the state to avoid prosecution. The Virginia Protectorate was effectively destroyed as an organization, though individual members who escaped prosecution continued to hold positions of influence throughout the region. The exposure of the Crofton Massacre had broader implications beyond the specific criminal prosecutions. The case became a catalyst for renewed federal attention to organized terrorism in the South and led to the passage of stronger civil rights legislation. It also inspired similar investigations in other states, resulting in the exposure of comparable conspiracies and the prosecution of additional terrorist organizations. Eleanor Crofton devoted the remainder of her life to ensuring that the victims of the massacre were not forgotten and that the lessons of their sacrifice were preserved for future generations. She established the Crofton Memorial Foundation, which provided scholarships for the descendants of the murdered workers and supported research into other instances of organized violence during the post-Reconstruction period. The foundation also worked to preserve the historical record of the massacre and its aftermath. Eleanor compiled a comprehensive archive of documents, testimony, and evidence related to the case, creating a resource that historians and researchers continue to use today. She insisted that the archive include not just the facts of the conspiracy, but the personal stories of the victims and the impact of their deaths on their families and communities. Eleanor's work extended beyond documentation to active education and advocacy. She spoke at schools, universities, and community organizations throughout the country, sharing the story of the Crofton Massacre and its significance in American history. She collaborated with other researchers to document similar crimes throughout the South, helping to build a comprehensive picture of organized terrorism during the post-Civil War period. The old Crofton Plantation was eventually converted into a memorial and educational center dedicated to the history of labor relations and civil rights in Virginia. The restored workers' cabins serve as exhibits that tell the stories of the 52 victims and place their lives in the broader context of the struggles faced by working people in the post-Reconstruction South. The western fields where the workers were buried have been converted into a memorial garden with walking paths and interpretive markers that explain the significance of the site. The Memorial Center has become an important destination for students, researchers, and visitors interested in understanding this dark chapter of American history. Educational programs connect the story of the Crofton Massacre to broader themes of civil rights, labor organizing, and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. The center's mission is not just to commemorate the victims, but to ensure that their sacrifice contributes to a better understanding of how organized oppression operates and how it can be resisted. The legacy of the Crofton Massacre extends far beyond the specific events of August 19, 1883. The case represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of organized terrorism during the post-Reconstruction period, providing scholars with unprecedented insight into how conspiracy and corruption were used to maintain systems of oppression. The detailed records preserved by Miriam Washington and uncovered by Eleanor Crofton have been used in dozens of academic studies and have helped expose similar crimes throughout the South. But perhaps more importantly, the story demonstrates the power of individual courage in confronting institutional evil. Miriam Washington's decision to document what she witnessed, despite the personal danger involved, preserved evidence that would eventually bring justice for the victims. Eleanor Crofton's determination to uncover the truth, even when faced with intimidation and legal obstacles, ensured that the conspiracy could not remain hidden forever. Their examples show that even the most powerful conspiracies can be exposed when individuals are willing to risk everything for justice. The case also highlights the importance of federal intervention in protecting civil rights when local institutions have been corrupted or intimidated. The Virginia Protectorate operated with impunity for decades because it controlled local law enforcement and political structures. Only federal investigation and prosecution could break the conspiracy's hold on power and bring the perpetrators to justice. Today, visitors to the Crofton Memorial Center can walk through the restored plantation grounds and see exhibits that tell the complete story of the massacre and its aftermath. They can visit the memorial garden where the 52 workers are commemorated and read their names on the monument that Eleanor Crofton helped design. They can also explore the research archives that contain thousands of documents related to the case and its broader historical significance. But the most powerful aspect of the memorial is the way it connects past and present. The story of the Crofton Massacre is not just a historical curiosity. It's a reminder that the struggle for equality and justice is ongoing, and that ordinary people have the power to make extraordinary changes when they choose to act with courage and determination. The 52 workers who died at Crofton Plantation believed in the possibility of a better future, a future where people of different backgrounds could work together with dignity and respect, where hard work would be rewarded fairly, and where children could receive education and opportunity regardless of their parents' race or social status. Their vision was silenced by violence, but their legacy lives on in the ongoing struggle for the justice and equality they died seeking. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that justice was ultimately served? Or do the crimes of the Virginia Protectorate represent a failure of our legal system that continues to echo today? How do we ensure that the sacrifice of these 52 workers contributes to a more just and equal society? Leave your comment below and tell us your thoughts on this dark but ultimately inspiring chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that uncover the hidden truths of our past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. These stories matter. They help us understand not just where we've been, but where we're going and how we can build a better future for everyone. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the shadows and light of American history.